So it always feels like we're kind of looking for that hack in life, right? We're looking for that thing that saves us a couple minutes in our day, maybe saves us a couple bucks. We're looking for that quick fix, for that shortcut. The internet is filled with, 5 simple tips to improve your life, or 3 sentences that will completely change the outlook on your situation. But oftentimes we read those things or we do those things and they kind of feel shallow, right? They feel empty. It feels like they will only last for so long. So we set out again, we look for the next fad, we look for the next fix, we look for the next cure. So over these next couple of weeks, we are gonna be looking at a couple of the cures for the struggles that you and I go through almost every single day. And asking simple questions like, what is the cure for burnout? What's the cure for suffering, for fear, idolatry, control, deceit, and more? And to be clear, we firmly believe that the cure for all of those things is Jesus. But if we were just to stand on stage and be like, the cure for suffering is Jesus, and then the next week, the cure for idolatry is Jesus, and then walk off stage, you probably wouldn't be super upset about a 45-second sermon, but you'd be like, okay, can you be a little more helpful than that, right? Now, to be clear, every single one of the preachers and communicators that you hear from over these next couple of weeks, we truly do believe that Jesus is the cure for every single thing that ails us, for every single thing that we struggle with. But we wanted to be just a little more helpful than that, okay? But we want to give you practical advice. Advice that is rooted in God's word, not what we think, not what we feel, not what the world tells us. Maybe not even the easiest thing or the quickest thing, because we believe that God's word holds the cure for everything in life that we struggle with every single day. So today, I want to talk about the cure for bitterness. Now, I can't stand on this stage and talk about the cure for bitterness, and I can't talk about the perils and the downfall of bitterness without me acknowledging that I am someone who has had his fair share of bitterness over the years. So I'm the youngest of 3. I have 2 older sisters. My oldest sister is Brooke. My second oldest sister is Robin. There's about 5 years or so between my oldest sister, Brooke, and there's about 2.5, 3 years between me and Robin. So I'm the baby of the family, which, where are my babies of the family at? Yeah, we're the best, right? Let's be real. Your parents had you, and they're like, we can't top this one. Why should we even try? This one's flawless. All the other ones, they're like, we should try again. Yeah, it's fine. All you older kids are like, no, that's not true. You're the problem in our family. We are. But being the baby, it has its perks, right? The rules were a little more relaxed growing up because those first couple kids, they were essentially experimented on because speaking as a parent, we have no idea what we're doing at any time, right? We're just like trying stuff. But it just kind of happens that way. We're just like, well, it's cool that we're kind of, the baby here. Now, growing up, my dad was really into cars, and he would build cars. He still is into cars, but he just doesn't have the time. He doesn't really have the desire to kind of like build them. But this started like way back when he was in high school. So before I was even born and kind of growing up, he was really, really into cars. And so as my oldest sister, Brooke, she started getting around that time where, she's gonna get her license, she's gonna, kind of get her first car. My dad was in his car building prime, okay? And so her first car was a 1968 Mustang, all right? That right there. So if you look, on the left is the blue one. That one's Brooke's car. On the right, the white one, that was actually my dad's car. And so even though that blue one right there, he bought it from a guy just a couple blocks away from our house. And even though it wasn't that far, it struggled to get home. But he spent nights and weekends on it and kind of built it and fixed it up and all that stuff. And he had it running amazingly, all right? So he was, like I said, kind of in his prime. And so that was my oldest sister, Brooke's first car. A couple years go by and Robin's turn, and Robin's, kind of around that age, 16, 17, where she's getting her license, she's, kind of getting to driving, and so they decide, well, we need to buy Robin a car. And so they buy her a 1966 Mustang, that right there. And let's be real, we'll never admit this, but Robin's car was actually nicer than Brooke's car. You could see that thing, like, it had that vinyl top on it. It was a really, really sweet car. So a couple years go by. It's my turn, let's go, all right. Well, a couple years go by, and my dad is no longer in his car building prime. He just doesn't have the desire to do it anymore, isn't really interested anymore, but I'm thinking like, man, Brooke got a sweet Mustang. Robin got an even better Mustang. Am I getting a Ferrari? Like, what am I getting here? What's going on here? And it goes around, and I get my license, and my parents buy me a 1993 Ford Ranger. That right there. Thanks, Mom and Dad. This thing was a manual transmission, had 200,000 miles on it. Man, this thing, it barely passed smog. I'm convinced that this car right here is the sole reason for the pollution in the Central Valley, all right? Like, this thing struggled every single day. Now, I want to admit something real quick. Those first two pictures are actually pictures of my sister's car. I texted my dad earlier in the week. I said, hey, do you have pictures of the two Mustangs and the Ranger? He goes, I have pictures of the Mustang. Why would I have pictures of the Ranger? So, full disclosure, that is not actually a picture of my car. Now, it looks identical to that. It's the same color. It was the same little pinstripe. It was almost identical to that. But he's like, even I don't want proof that we bought that thing, okay? That's how embarrassed they were of my first car. The other ones, they're like, I've got pictures galore of it. My parents are sitting right over there, and I will continue to make fun of them for the rest of my life for it. But man, I was so bitter. I was bitter that my sisters got these sweet cars and I got a tetanus shot on wheels, and it just wasn't fair. And yes, 20 years later, I am still bitter about that, and I will still make comments to my parents. But for some of us, bitterness isn't rooted in a silly little car, right? Bitterness is rooted in a deep pain that you and I have experienced. It's rooted in a family member that let us down, a parent that wasn't there, a spouse that betrayed us, a boss that singled you out, or a situation that wasn't fair. And bitterness is this word that you and I kind of throw around all the time. And it's one of those words, it's kind of hard to define, right? It's one of those words where we don't know exactly how to put it into words, but we know it when we see it. We know what bitterness is. And I was trying to rack my brain of like, man, what would be like kind of the ideal way to kind of define bitterness? And what I was thinking about is bitterness is a situation or something that happened that you say to yourself, I can't believe that happened. I can't believe they got away with this. I can't believe they said that. And because of that situation, because of that person, you have anger, you have hurt, you have pain because of it, and you're holding on to it. But why is bitterness so bad? What does it do to us? See, oftentimes you and I think we just have control over our bitterness when we actually don't have control over it. We convince ourselves, I can stop being bitter at any time. It's not a big deal. Or maybe we just downplay it. Oh, that bitterness is totally fine. For others of us, we have just flat out accepted that we are bitter at a person or a situation, and we don't see the problem with it. And the Bible warns us over and over and over about the potential pitfall of bitterness. Bitterness is mentioned in the Old Testament books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Writers of the New Testament like Paul, Peter, and James write how destructive bitterness can be. But one of the most revealing passages in all of the Bible about bitterness is actually by an unknown author. It's found in the book of Hebrews. We don't actually know who wrote the book of Hebrews. So if you have your Bible, turn with me to Hebrews chapter 12. If you don't have your Bible, don't worry about it. Every single verse I read is gonna be up on the screen so you can follow along. But Hebrews chapter 12 reveals three important things about bitterness. Things that you and I need to kind of understand. And when we read it, we'll think, man, I've never thought of it that way. But the Bible is so interesting because it puts into words what you and I have probably experienced before and how it affects our lives. So Hebrews chapter 12, we're gonna start in verse 14, read 14 and 15. The writer of Hebrews says this. It says, make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. So the writer starts off right away with basically saying, you need to live at peace with everyone, and then it calls us to be holy. Now, holiness is another topic that's talked about over and over, specifically in the New Testament. And we often think holiness is perfect. It's like, well, God's calling us to be perfect. That's not fair. And that's not really what the word is translated here. The Greek word is hagiasmos. And hagiasmos doesn't mean perfect. It means to be set apart. It means to be different. Oftentimes, some of the writers of the New Testament will use this as a process of becoming hagiasmos. So the process of becoming holy, the process of becoming different, the process of becoming set apart. And it's this almost lifelong journey of saying you need to begin the process of becoming who Jesus actually is. And so it's calling us to live and think differently. It's calling us to live a different life. And this is so important when it comes to bitterness because you and I just think we're justified in our bitterness, right? Well, I could just stay bitter and people around you be like, yeah, you have every right to be angry. You have every right to be bitter. You are justified in your bitterness. And God is calling us to a different life. God is calling us to a life that is free from bitterness. And so the writer tells us 3 unique things about bitterness. The Bible just doesn't say like bitterness is bad and then say nothing about it. No, it actually explains why bitterness is bad, what is so destructive about it. And it says it in those couple sentences, those 3 things. The first thing that it tells us about bitterness, your first fill-in, bitterness grows up. You see, what this is meaning is if bitterness is not dealt with, it will get worse and worse. Think of it like a water leak in your house. You know, you've got like a little leaky faucet or something like that. A couple drops here and there, it's not really making that big of a deal, right? You wipe it up. But if you just let that water leak go and go and go, eventually it destroys it, right? You can't just be like, oh, it's fine over there. No, it's not a big deal. No, that's the same idea with bitterness. It grows up. If you don't handle bitterness right when it happens, the problem gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Something that happened weeks, months, or years ago, we didn't deal with it at the time. We didn't have the conversation with that person. We didn't seek out peace. We didn't try for reconciliation. Reconciliation is this idea where 2 parties that were far apart got brought back together. Talks a lot about that in the New Testament when it comes to Jesus and us. Basically, Jesus and mankind, God and mankind, were far apart, and because of the reconciliation that Jesus did, we can be brought back together. But when we don't do that, the conflict gets worse. We get more angry, more hurt, more distant, and more bitter. Bitterness grows up. We cannot simply ignore it when we feel it. The second thing it says, bitterness produces trouble. You see, when we're mad at that person, when we're frustrated with that situation, bitterness and all that stuff, it kind of takes place in our life and it grows chaos in our life, right? It affects how we think, how we feel, and how we act. It affects our relationships. It affects our mood. It affects our view on life. Think about it like that leaky faucet, right? That leaky faucet that grew up and then it produced trouble. Eventually that leak led to mold. Eventually that leak eroded the foundation of your home. Bitterness can do the same thing to your life. It can erode the foundation of your very life. This bitterness that we thought we had control over, we don't. It grew up, it produced trouble, and it destroyed everything in its path. Third thing, bitterness infects others. Bitterness doesn't just affect us, it infects others. Where it says right there, it says bitterness will defile many. That defile word, it means to pollute, to stain, to corrupt. It basically just kind of affects everyone around you. Have you ever been around a person where they're so bitter with a situation or a person? Now, I'm gonna say this as like, someone else, because there's no one bitter in here, right? Like think of someone else, it's fine. But think about it like this. You have that person that is so bitter about a situation. That bitterness has grown up in their life. That bitterness has produced trouble in their life. And because of it, they're just full of hate. They're full of anger. And you often view that, and it usually has one of 2 outcomes. You often view the person that is bitter a little lesser, or you view the situation of the person they're bitter at in a lesser way. Let me explain what that means. So you have this person that's very bitter about a situation, right? They're so full of hate and anger that you actually it causes you to view them a little less. You're like, oh man, why are they like that? And it actually maybe it affects how much time you spend with them. Maybe it causes you to view them differently. I view them differently as a spouse because of this. I view them differently as a friend, as an employee, as a boss, maybe even as a follower of Jesus. And we don't want that bitterness to rub off on us, so we limit the amount of time that we spend with them, or we limit the amount of influence that they have over us, because like, man, I don't want to be bitter like that. And so I'm going to push away from them. The second thing, it also causes us to view the situation or person they're bitter at differently, right? You ever seen this, experienced this before? It's like we are not even involved in the situation, but we are somehow bitter. It's like that original bitter person was like a super spreader. You guys know what super spreaders are? Like remember back in COVID when you popped a positive test, you got COVID, and you immediately turned into Sherlock Holmes, like trying to figure out who was the one, who got me sick. I need to know now. Like your Wednesday night turned into a Nancy Drew novel and you're just like scrolling social media. You have red string and like connecting people and you're like, no, this person was sick on Monday and I got sick on Tuesday. And at the end of the night, you're like, it was the receptionist in my office. She had a runny nose last Thursday at 2:45. She was patient zero. She was the super spreader. And that's what bitterness is. It spreads to everyone around us. It infects everyone with bitterness. It spreads like a disease. It infects everyone we touch. This is what the Bible is talking about when it says it defiles many. We are polluting our friends and corrupting their point of view. And I get this can be so tempting that you have a friend that's just venting to you. You have a family member that's venting you and you want to support them, right? Yeah, oh man, I can't believe that situation like that. Oh, I can't believe they said that. I can't believe they did that. And you want to be supportive of that. I'm not saying don't be supportive of that, but be very careful with this because that bitterness can then affect you. And then that bitterness grows up. That bitterness produces trouble. And that bitterness affects the other people around you. And the cycle continues over and over and over. We have to be so careful with how we let bitterness affect our lives. But how do we combat this? How do we move past bitterness? Because for some of us, we have experienced real hurt and pain. Maybe it was a divorce or a breakup or a betrayal or being let go from a job. And I think moving past the bitterness, healing from that bitterness, it starts with properly framing the bitterness in our life. So let's say you're one of those people that you have some bitterness right now in your life. You're mad at a situation, you're bitter at a person, whatever it is. I wanna ask you 3 questions today. And I want you to think of these 3 questions kind of like a flow chart. If you have ever seen a flow chart, if you haven't, here's the idea of a flow chart. Basically, if you answer one way to question 1, you're gonna move on to question 2. If you don't answer one way to question 1, you're gonna stop. If you answer one way to question 2, you're gonna move on to question 3. I promise this will make a little bit more sense in a minute. But here's what I want you to understand. If you answer yes to question 1, then maybe it's time to move on to question 2. If you answer yes to question 2, then it's time to move on to question 3. Now, if you answer no to either question 1 or question 2, it's time for you to re-examine the bitterness in your life. It's time for you to kind of stop in your tracks and say, maybe this bitterness shouldn't actually be in my life. Maybe it needs to be fixed. Maybe it needs to be re-examined. So if you have some bitterness, I want to start with a simple question. Was it an injustice? I meet with people all the time and they'll talk with me and they'll say they're bitter about this, they're angry about this situation, this person said this happened, and they'll go through the laundry list of things and we'll meet in the frat house, it'll be 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and we'll just kind of be talking and at the end of it, after the laundry list of things that they have felt wronged by, I'll have to say in my nicest pastor voice, so what are you mad about again? Because there's some things that just we shouldn't be mad at, right? And I want to be very clear before I move on. There are some serious, legitimate, painful hurts that you have experienced. And in no way am I trying to diminish those things. If you do have some of those serious wounds, we're gonna talk about those in just a minute. And I want to talk about how you can maybe view those differently in just a minute as well. But for some of us, We are mad and bitter about some really dumb things in life, okay? Maybe you're mad and bitter about something that was actually your fault in the first place. Maybe you're mad and bitter, but you were the cause of the fight. You were the cause of the conflict. You were the cause of the pain. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter is talking about how to kind of deal with conflict and how he puts it, he uses the word injustice here. And something that we maybe think as an injustice and how maybe if that injustice happens, that can harbor some bitterness in our own heart and mind. And he says this, 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 18. He says, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourself to your masters. Not only those who are good and considerate, but also those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and enduring it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. So what Peter is saying right here is you can't be mad and bitter about something that you caused, a punishment that you deserved in the first place. He says right there, if you receive a beating for wrongdoing and endure it, that's not an injustice. You did something wrong, you paid the price. You know what most people would call that? Justice, right? That's not an injustice, that's actually justice. You can't be mad about those things. You don't get credit for dealing with the consequences of your actions. You can't be bitter about something that you shouldn't be bitter at in the first place. Should I really be crying about my parents giving my sisters nicer cars than me? No. And in all seriousness, I'm not bitter at all. I will bring this story up till the day I die because I think it's hilarious to make fun of my parents, but I'm truly not bitter about it. Wanna know why? My parents bought me that car. I didn't deserve that car in the first place. Yes, it was a piece of junk, but it was a free piece of junk. Can't really get mad at that, right? We need to own our part in the conflict. We need to own our part in the disagreement. You will never be cured from bitterness if you never understand the role that you played in it in the first place. You will also never be cured from bitterness if bitterness is your default. If bitterness is the first thing that you run to. If bitterness is the last thing that you hold on to. So the question, is this really an injustice like Peter is talking about here? If it isn't, it's time to let it go. It's time to move on. It's time to be free. It's time to be cured. Because you're bitter about something you shouldn't be bitter about in the first place. But for some of us, that injustice, that pain, that betrayal, that hurt was and is very real in our life. Your pain is justified. Your pain is heavy. And maybe it's kind of a tricky situation sometimes, right? Maybe you understand I did play a part in this, but maybe the consequences didn't actually fit the action. The punishment didn't fit the crime. Well, I did this, but I felt like it was injustice because, man, they punished me so severely, and I'm just kind of bitter at this. And I think it was an injustice. I think it was a little unfair, and I don't know what to do with it. This isn't you being angry over nothing. This is you being angry and hurt and bitter over something that has deeply affected you, and that bitterness is very real, and you don't know how to get out of it. So maybe you answered that first question with, yes, I was treated unfairly. I was betrayed. There was an injustice. If that's you, my second question for you is, have you tried to make peace? That Hebrews verse right from the beginning tells us to make every effort to live in peace. Have you done that? Have you tried to have an actual conversation with that person? And I'm not just saying a conversation where you yell and scream because, well, you hurt me, therefore I'm going to hurt you now. That's not helpful. That will never bring reconciliation. That will never bring peace. Actually, most of the time, it causes the fight to be worse, right? But no, have you actually attempted reconciliation? Have you actually attempted to bring two parties back together? Because over and over in the Bible, it tells us to live at peace with people, make peace with those around us. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." In Mark chapter 9, Jesus tells his disciples to be at peace with one another. Romans chapter 12 says, "As long as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." Romans 14 says, "Make every effort to do what leads to peace." You need more verses? Cool, I've got more. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 reminds us that God has called us to live in peace. Colossians chapter 3 tells us to let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. 1 Peter 3 tells us to turn from evil and to pursue peace. God is urging every single one of us to pursue after peace, to live at peace with the people around us. Do you want to be cured from bitterness? Live at peace with the people around you, because peace and bitterness cannot coexist. They cannot be roommates. They do not get along. You cannot have both. You can either choose peace or bitterness, not both. And for a lot of us, it starts with us entering into a conversation with that person. Some of y'all spend more time talking about the person than you do talking to the person. Some of you guys spend more time talking about the problem than talking to the problem. You spend more time thinking about all the ways you can fix the situation instead of actually fixing the situation. It's time for us to enter into those conversations. And it might not be fixed on the first conversation, but you're gonna start the process. You're gonna start the process of healing. You're gonna start the process of reconciliation. And that process might take weeks or months or years. It might be something that is going on for the rest of your life. But as you pursue peace, you leave behind bitterness. And I'm not guaranteeing that pain will ever go away. That pain might always be there. That hurt might always be there. But the bitterness can leave. The bitterness can be lessened in your life. That bitterness that grew up, that bitterness that caused trouble, that bitterness that affected everyone around you, it can be lessened in your life. And you can pursue after a new life. But let's say you still have bitterness in your heart. You have established that an injustice took place. You have tried to make peace. You have tried to reconcile, and it feels like nothing you are doing is working. I've tried to go about this way, I've tried to go about that way, and it just feels like you are running up against a brick wall. I want to ask you the final question. Are you trusting in the perfect judge? 1 Peter chapter 2, we read verses 18 through 20. We're gonna go right to the next verse in verse 21 and read to 23. This is what Peter says. "To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly." So Peter starts off with verse 18 saying we need to have reverent fear of God. And then he ends with an example of Jesus who entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. If you were here for Good Friday, you heard a powerful message from Jake about Jesus being arrested and tortured and killed and mocked. And they were hurling insults at him. They were slapping him. They were beating him. And even when other people lied about Jesus, even when Jesus suffered, even when Jesus was being treated unfairly, he did not retaliate. He did not make threats. He did not become filled with bitterness. Instead, it said that Jesus entrusted himself to the judge who is just. Other versions say the perfect judge, the righteous judge, the fair judge. In the book of Luke, it actually tells us that while Jesus was on the cross, after the beating, after the mockery, after the arrest, while he is being killed, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." That doesn't sound like a man full of bitterness to me. That sounds like a man full of peace and trying to pursue after peace with everything he has. If you have tried to make peace, if you have tried to reconcile, if you tried to move on from your bitterness and it feels like nothing is working, it's time to trust a God who has perfect judgment. You see, where injustice happens, God is still there. Where pain takes place, God is still with us. Where betrayal has happened, it says that God is near to the brokenhearted. Do you want to be cured from your bitterness? It's time to entrust your heart and your mind into the perfect judge. Maybe that means you pray today and that you begin to heal your heart and your mind. Heal from everything that's happened, that you no longer hold on to the past, you no longer hold on to the hurt, you no longer hold on to the bitterness. For a lot of you, that bitterness is just weighing you down. It feels like you have just this heavy weight on your shoulders. And you're saying, God, I can't do this anymore. Yes, I know there was injustice. Yes, I've tried to make peace. I've tried to reconcile, but there's nothing I can do. And I don't know how much longer I can hold on to this weight. Are you ready to give that weight over to Jesus and entrust yourself to him and say, God, will you carry this for me? Because I can't carry it anymore. I can't do this anymore. This bitterness has grown up. It's caused so much chaos in my life, and it has infected every single person, and I don't want that anymore. God, I don't have peace in my life because I have too much bitterness, and I'm not close to you because of everything that's happened. Will you trust God today and say, God, I'm ready to move on from this? I want to end with this passage in James. James chapter 3, verse 13. It's an encouragement to you. Here's what it says. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that come from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find every disorder and every evil practice. Harsh words, but then it says this. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy, good fruit, impartial and sincere, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. If you sow peace, if you pursue after peace, if you try to be a peacemaker in life, it says it right there, you will reap righteousness. And you will leave behind the bitterness that is weighing you down, the bitterness that has infected every part of your life. Today, I pray that you choose peace over bitterness, that you choose healing over pain. I don't know what decision you need to make today. Maybe you need to come forward in just a minute. We're gonna have pastors and leaders down here, and maybe you need to come forward and you just need to confess, I have so much bitterness in my heart right now. I need some help. I need someone to encourage me. I need someone to walk through this process with me because it's been going on for years and I just need help. Maybe for others of you, you understand what that reconciliation process looks like because you don't have it. You need to be reconciled back to God. You and God are so distant right now. And if that's you, it's time for you to pursue after peace. It's time for you to pursue after the God who is peace-loving and who cares deeply about you. He wants that peace in your life. He doesn't want bitterness. He doesn't want hurt. He doesn't want anger. He doesn't want pain. He wants so much more for your life. I don't know what decision you need to make today, but we'll have pastors and leaders up here. Would you stand? Would you sing?